Avatar: The Way of Water. After the first film debuted in 2009, the sequel is finally in theaters this week. Was it worth the wait? Let's discuss. Hey everyone, I'm David Chen. I usually talk about movies, TV, and technology here on this YouTube channel, and I'm here to talk about Avatar: The Way of Water. Some ground rules: this is a non-spoilery review. So what that means is I'm going to talk about stuff that's in the trailers, but very little is in the trailers. There's been a teaser trailer and one or two other official trailers, but the central plot of this movie has not yet been revealed. So I'm going to be very, very vague about what's going on in this film, and maybe later I'll follow this up with a full spoiler discussion. But as always, if you are worried about learning anything about the movie, including my opinion on it, you should not watch this video. Go watch the movie and then come back. Let's start by talking about what I really loved about this movie. I think when you go to see a James Cameron Avatar film, you're probably expecting great visuals, and Avatar: The Way of Water really delivers. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this film and its sequels, and it really is all up there on the screen. When the first Avatar was released in 2009, it really showed what was possible using CG technology to create new worlds and new characters, and it often looked photorealistic. Avatar 2 feels like it's doing the same thing. The Way of Water renders these characters and creatures with tons of realistic lighting and textures, and it just looks like an amazing world that you want to get lost in. You're also probably wondering how good the action is in Avatar: The Way of Water, and I'm really happy to tell you it's pretty incredible. James Cameron continues to be an excellent action filmmaker, and he shoots a lot of his action scenes classically, meaning using pretty conventional editing and shot composition, but using these incredible CG creations and technology that just make it feel hyper real. And it all really works beautifully. When I'm watching the movie and an action scene occurs, I'm just on the edge of my seat and really impressed by what James Cameron can do when he puts his mind to it. So you might be saying, David Chen, great visuals, great action, that sounds amazing. Why don't you seem that excited? And that is because I don't think Avatar: The Way of Water is a particularly good film. I think a good comparison point is The Force Awakens, Star Wars Episode 7. That was a movie that introduced a bunch of new characters and new locations, but pretty much everything else about the movie was a repeat of Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope. It had similar story beats, similar emotional beats, similar character archetypes, even similar themes. That feels to me like a lot of what Avatar: The Way of Water is doing. It's reintroducing the world of Avatar to a new generation of filmmakers 13 years later after the first film came out. Now, of course, there have not been 5 intervening films like there were with The Force Awakens, but it's kind of the same idea. Now, you might think to yourself, that sounds great. If so, you're probably going to love this film. If you liked Avatar 1, you're like, I'd just like to see that kind of again with a little bit of a different spin on it, then I think you'll have a great time. Me, I was looking for something a little bit more. Let's start with the characters. We meet a lot of new characters in this movie, and it really feels like the movie is unfocused. The movie needs to reintroduce the old characters from the first Avatar that return, and also introduce a bunch of new ones, and quite honestly, I didn't love any of the new characters. Now, I am not saying Jake Sully, played by Sam Worthington, is one of the most compelling characters I've ever seen, but I do think that Neytiri was an extremely compelling character from the first Avatar. And the new characters, by comparison, feel really thinly drawn. I feel like I barely know anything about them before we are expecting to really start caring about them. And I just found them to be pretty uninteresting. And of course, they take away time that could be spent with the original couple of Jake and Neytiri from the first Avatar. I don't think it's a spoiler to say those two characters show up in this movie in some form, but I really didn't find their arc, their journey together in this film to be particularly well fleshed out, and that is kind of a bummer for me, especially given what it was replaced with. I can't really talk about what story beats were repeated in this film because I don't want to spoil anything, but I can say that the first film, Avatar in 2009, was criticized for being a white savior anti-colonialist fantasy. The first film asked the question, what if a white person could go and undo the crimes of the colonialists, perhaps even fight against them effectively, and be one with the native people? It trafficked in relatively tired tropes, and there's a reason a lot of those movies don't get made anymore. It's because we've already seen that story play out, and many people find it offensive. With Avatar: The Way of Water, I was hoping that the filmmakers would show at least some kind of introspection around some of those themes from Avatar 1, and maybe work to subvert them, or acknowledge them, or veer in a different direction in some way. But without spoiling anything, I'll just say that I don't find the film's depiction of the dynamics between colonizers and natives from the first film to be particularly more nuanced or interesting this time around. There is a new idea in this movie around family and found family, but the same central conflict of the first film feels just repeated again in Avatar: The Way of Water. I also have to say I found the stakes in Avatar: The Way of Water to feel just a lot lower than the stakes in Avatar 1. Avatar 1 felt like a monumental event in those people's worlds, like both the Na'vi and the human. Like, you divide history into like before and after Avatar 1 happened for everyone involved, because it felt consequential what was happening. Maybe if the Na'vi fought these people off well enough and long enough and effectively enough, they could prevent them from returning and strip mining Pandora. Avatar: The Way of Water feels like much lower stakes, like the events happening are much smaller and less consequential. It feels like a chapter in a longer book about what's going on in this story, as opposed to the entire book, which is what Avatar 1 felt like. And after over a decade wait for this sequel, I kind of was hoping that it would feel higher stakes to me. There is one other important thing I want to talk about, and that is the format in which this film is shown. I watched this movie in a 3D Dolby Atmos screening that had a variable frame rate. What is a variable frame rate? A typical film is shot and projected at 24 frames per second, and the mind is kind of conditioned to understand that as what the cinematic look is. Obviously, on YouTube and other places, you can watch videos in higher frame rates, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, etc. But most movies are 24 frames per second. With Avatar: The Way of Water and the recent Avatar re-release, James Cameron wanted to play around with higher frame rates. There are many parts of this movie that take place in higher frame rates, and I don't mind the concept of higher frame rates. I don't mind that idea, but the execution, in my opinion, is disastrous. Because what happens in this movie is there are portions that are in higher frame rates, and then it will often cut to a regular 24 frames per second, often mid-scene. And that kind of cut back and forth happens hundreds of times throughout the course of the movie, by my estimate. So imagine you're watching a scene play out in like super smooth higher frame rates, and then all of a sudden it'll cut to 24 frames per second, and then it will cut back to higher frame, and then so on and so forth. Just like many times during the course of an action scene, every single time one of these cuts happens, it rips me out of the reality of the film. I think this is a bigger deal if you are a gamer. I play a lot of video games, and my eye can tell the difference between 60 FPS and 30 FPS and 24 FPS. And if you are like me, then you will notice every single time the frame rate changes during the course of the movie. Of course, if you don't notice those changes and you have motion smoothing turned on your TV, then you probably won't care and you'll enjoy this movie for what it is. But for me, I really hated watching this movie with variable frame rate. As I was watching the movie, I was thinking to myself, I would much prefer to go back in time and rewatch this movie at one constant frame rate all the way through, because then I would at least have the immersion of like understanding this as the world. But because of the variable frame rate, like I just got really disoriented, and it was overall an unpleasant viewing experience. So if you can at all watch the movie at a standard single frame rate, that's what I would encourage, but your mileage may vary. You may not care, you may enjoy the higher frame rates. I'm just speaking from my experience. I will say one positive thing about the variable frame rates though, and that is the underwater scenes at the higher frame rates look incredible. Like, I was watching the movie and I was seeing the higher frame rates and I was like, okay, like I kind of get why he wanted to do this. Then they got to the underwater scenes and I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. This looks like a nature documentary of an actual location that looks fantastical and beautiful and gorgeous and amazing. And I got why James Cameron wanted to do the higher frame rates. So it may be worth it to you to just see those underwater scenes with the high frame rates. For me, it wasn't worth the disorientation. But again, your mileage may vary. So at the end of the day, I wanted James Cameron to prove all of his critics wrong. I wanted Avatar: The Way of Water to blow me away. But this is probably one of my least favorite James Cameron movies. It has amazing visuals. It has amazing action. It has amazing CG technology. But the story is really lackluster. It feels like a half-hearted rehash of the first movie with some family elements added in there. And I just found it to be equally thematically uninteresting and troubling as the first film. But hey, those are just my thoughts on Avatar: The Way of Water. Let me know what you think in the comments, respectfully, of course. And if you want me to do a full spoiler review, hit me up and let me know that as well. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit like, subscribe, hit that bell icon to get notifications. And I want to give a big shout out to all of my patrons at patreon.com/DaveChen. Sign up at patreon.com/DaveChen to get bonus audio, bonus video, and support the work that I do, all the podcasts and videos I make. Thanks to all the patrons at patreon.com/DaveChen for making my work possible. We'll see you in the next one.